There is a version of you that exists for exactly 45 minutes every single morning, a version whose entire chemistry has already been decided before you've said a word, checked your phone, or even fully opened your eyes. Somewhere inside that window, a decision gets made that determines how your stomach will feel by 9 o'clock, how steady your energy will be by 2 in the afternoon, and how efficiently your body will process every single meal you eat for the rest of the day. Almost nobody knows this window exists, and almost everybody, without realizing it, spends those 45 minutes working directly against their own biology. I want to tell you about a woman I'll call Margaret, because her story is the reason this topic stopped being theoretical for me. She was 67, active, careful about what she ate, the kind of patient who does everything right on paper. For nearly 2 years, she'd been waking up with a dull ache in her stomach that no doctor could quite explain. She'd cut spicy food, she'd stopped her evening glass of wine, she'd tried 3 different antacids. Nothing changed. It wasn't until we walked through her morning, minute by minute, that the pattern became obvious. Alarm at 6:30, coffee in hand by 6:45. Nothing else in her stomach for another hour, sometimes longer. The problem was never dinner. It was happening in a 15-minute window most people never even think to examine. To understand why that window matters, you have to understand what your body is doing while you're still asleep. Sleep isn't a shutdown. It's closer to a night shift. Your organs repairing tissue, your hormones recalibrating, your brain clearing metabolic waste. And somewhere in the final hour or two before you wake, your adrenal glands begin releasing a hormone that has a terrible public reputation: cortisol. Most people hear that word and think stress, burnout, anxiety. But that's only half the story. In this specific context, cortisol is less like an alarm bell and more like a stage manager, quietly cueing every system in your body to get ready for the day. Researchers call this natural surge the cortisol awakening response, and it typically peaks within 30 to 45 minutes of opening your eyes, which, not coincidentally, is exactly the window that was quietly working against Margaret every single morning. Here's the part almost nobody explains clearly. That same cortisol surge doesn't just wake up your brain, it wakes up your stomach. It signals your gastric glands to start producing hydrochloric acid, priming your digestive system for its first task of the day. And this acid is not gentle. Your stomach's natural pH can sit between 1 and 3.5, roughly in the same range of acidity you'd associate with substances capable of dissolving metal. Your body isn't careless about this. It protects the stomach wall with a continuously regenerating layer of mucus, a living barrier standing between corrosive acid and the delicate tissue beneath it. Under ordinary circumstances, this is an elegant system, but there's a catch, and it's the catch that explains what was happening to Margaret. When cortisol stays elevated longer than necessary, evidence suggests it can slow the rate at which that protective mucus regenerates. So, for a brief window after waking, your stomach can be holding more acid than usual, with a slightly thinner shield guarding it, on top of a stomach that's already been empty for 6, 7, sometimes 8 hours overnight. Now picture what most of us do in that exact window. We reach for coffee. Here's what caught my attention when I started digging into the research more seriously. Caffeine independently triggers its own cortisol release. So drinking coffee during your natural cortisol peak doesn't just add a stimulant to your system, it stacks 2 hormonal spikes directly on top of each other. Cortisol stays elevated longer than it would on its own. Mucus production stays suppressed longer than it needs to, and all of this acid, now less protected than usual, meets a mildly acidic beverage with nothing in the stomach to buffer it. That was Margaret's entire morning, repeated for 2 years, and nobody had ever connected the dots for her. I want to be clear about something, because this is a subject people feel strongly about. This isn't an argument against coffee. Coffee carries its own well-documented benefits: antioxidants, improved alertness, even some protective associations with long-term health in the research literature. This is entirely about timing, not elimination. The difference between drinking coffee the instant you wake up and waiting even 20 or 30 minutes can meaningfully change what that window does to your stomach. Some research points to 90 minutes, once the cortisol peak has largely settled, as closer to ideal. If 90 minutes sounds unrealistic, given how your actual mornings run, even a short, consistent delay appears to make a measurable difference. So if not coffee first, then what fills that window? The answer is almost insultingly simple, which is exactly why most people dismiss it without trying it. Water. Not sparkling, not flavored, not ice cold, just plain water, ideally warm or at room temperature, before anything else touches your stomach. Consider what's actually happening physiologically while you sleep. Your body loses somewhere between half a liter and a full liter of fluid overnight, simply through breathing and low-grade perspiration. By the time your eyes open, you're already mildly dehydrated, before your day has technically even started. Your digestive enzymes require adequate hydration to function properly. A dehydrated digestive system runs slower, and a slower system, almost by definition, is a less protected one. When you introduce water first, several things happen at once. The concentrated acid sitting in your empty stomach becomes diluted. Your body receives a biochemical cue to accelerate mucus renewal along the stomach lining, and peristalsis, the rhythmic muscular wave that pushes material through your digestive tract, begins reactivating after hours of relative stillness. Temperature isn't incidental here either. Warm water relaxes the smooth muscle tissue lining your gastrointestinal tract, easing this reactivation. Cold water can cause mild contraction in some people, which is why a large glass of ice water first thing occasionally produces a brief cramping sensation. Not dangerous, just not particularly cooperative with what your body is trying to accomplish. Margaret's fix, once we identified the pattern, wasn't dramatic. 2 cups of warm water on waking, a 30-minute delay before her first coffee. Within about 10 days, the morning discomfort that had followed her for 2 years was largely gone. Not because of a new medication, not because of an elimination diet, because of a 15-minute sequence she'd simply never been taught to think about. But there's a second layer to this story, and it's the one that changed how I personally think about breakfast entirely. When you eat your first meal of the day, you are not eating alone. Living inside your digestive tract right now are somewhere between 30 and 40 trillion microbial cells, a population roughly comparable in size to the total number of human cells that make up your entire body. You are not simply a person who happens to host some bacteria. You are, in a very literal biological sense, an ecosystem wearing a name tag. And every meal you eat is a meal for that entire ecosystem, not just for you. This isn't a passive arrangement. These organisms are doing real metabolic labor on your behalf, continuously. Certain bacterial species synthesize B vitamins your own cells cannot produce independently. Others generate short-chain fatty acids that your colon cells rely on as a primary fuel source. A significant share of your immune system's regulatory signaling originates in direct response to gut microbial activity. And here's a fact that surprises most people the first time they hear it. A substantial portion of your body's serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with mood, isn't produced in your brain at all. It's produced in your gut, shaped heavily by which bacterial species you're feeding. Specific species matter in specific ways. Lactobacillus and bifidobacterium ferment dietary fiber, and in doing so, make your gut environment structurally difficult for less beneficial organisms to compete in. Akkermansia muciniphila actively stimulates renewal of that same protective mucus layer we talked about earlier, the one guarding your stomach and intestinal walls. Faecalibacterium prausnitzii produces butyrate, considered one of the most important fuel sources for the cells lining your colon, and a key contributor to gut barrier integrity. After a full night of fasting, your first meal isn't just breakfast for you. It's the opening feeding of the day for tens of trillions of organisms that quietly influence your digestion, your immune resilience, and even your emotional baseline. This reframes the entire question of what breakfast should be. It stops being simply, "What do I feel like eating?" and becomes, "Which population inside me am I choosing to strengthen today?" This is where a lot of well-intentioned breakfasts quietly go wrong. Sweetened cereal, white toast, a glass of orange juice, even versions marketed as healthy. Bacteria that thrive on rapidly absorbed sugar are a fundamentally different population than bacteria that thrive on slow fermenting fiber. Feed one group consistently, and it expands. Feed it every morning for years, and your entire internal ecosystem gradually reflects exactly what you've been feeding it. Not dramatically overnight, but accumulating quietly across months and years. Orange juice is a perfect example of a food that seems healthy, but tells a more complicated story. A single glass typically contains the natural sugar of 3 or 4 whole oranges, with almost none of the accompanying fiber. Strip the fiber away, and that sugar hits your bloodstream fast. Insulin spikes sharply, then drops, and that drop is very often what people experience as the mid-morning energy crash that sends them reaching for something sweet by 10 o'clock. Eat the whole orange instead, and its fiber and pectin slow that sugar's journey, giving your colon bacteria something to actually ferment and use, rather than letting it vanish into your bloodstream before it ever reaches them. There's a deeper mechanism at play here, one that surprised me when I first saw it laid out clearly in the research, and it might be the single most useful idea in this entire video. It's called the second meal effect, and it describes something genuinely remarkable. The composition of your breakfast doesn't just affect how you feel after breakfast, it measurably shapes how your body responds to lunch, hours later. When your first meal includes adequate soluble fiber, the kind found in whole oats, apples, pears, and legumes, it slows gastric emptying and produces a steadier, more proportionate blood sugar response. That effect doesn't switch off once breakfast is digested. It carries forward, quietly shaping the metabolic tone of your entire day. 2 people can eat an identical lunch and experience meaningfully different blood sugar responses, purely based on what they ate hours earlier. This matters more as we age, not less. Insulin sensitivity naturally shifts across the decades, and the margin for metabolic error tends to narrow with time. A pattern the body could easily absorb and correct at 30 or 40 can become something it compounds and carries forward at 60 and beyond. Your breakfast, in other words, isn't an isolated event. It's a signal that echoes through the rest of your day. So what does an evidence-informed morning actually look like, stripped of unnecessary complexity? It comes down to 3 deliberate steps, layered in sequence rather than crammed into a rigid checklist. First, water, roughly 1 to 2 cups, warm or at room temperature, before your phone, before coffee, before anything else touches your system. This single step dilutes concentrated stomach acid, activates peristalsis, supports mucus renewal, and begins rehydrating the enzymatic processes your digestion depends on. Second, time. A deliberate gap of at least 30 minutes before introducing caffeine, letting your natural cortisol peak settle on its own terms, rather than stacking a second spike on top of it. Third, and arguably most important, the actual composition of your first meal, built around soluble, fermentable fiber your gut bacteria can genuinely use. Whole oats remain one of the most researched sources here, largely because of a specific compound called beta-glucan, studied extensively for its relationship to cholesterol levels, blood sugar regulation, and microbiome diversity. Adding chia seeds or ground flaxseed contributes additional soluble fiber along with plant-based omega-3 fatty acids, giving beneficial bacteria more raw material to work with. Protein deserves equal weight here, not as an afterthought. After a night without food, your muscle tissue is particularly receptive to amino acids, and research increasingly suggests that spreading protein evenly across the day outperforms concentrating most of it at dinner, which is the pattern many people default into without thinking. For adults over 60 specifically, many researchers point to roughly 25 to 40 grams of protein per meal as supportive of healthy muscle maintenance. Eggs remain one of the simplest complete sources available, and plain yogurt, genuinely plain, without added sugar, brings something additional that almost nothing else on this list offers: live, fermented cultures. This is the piece missing from most morning routines entirely. Fermented foods, plain yogurt, kefir, cottage cheese with live active cultures, kimchi if it suits your palate, introduce beneficial bacteria directly into your system, rather than simply feeding the ones already present. Research examining dietary patterns in healthy adults has associated consistent fermented food intake with measurable increases in microbiome diversity and reductions in markers of systemic inflammation, sometimes within a relatively short window of consistent use. Plain yogurt manages to cover two important bases simultaneously: meaningful protein and live fermentation, without requiring a recipe or any real effort at all. Here's something worth sitting with as we bring this together. Your gut isn't a passive tube food simply passes through on its way somewhere else. It contains its own independent nervous system, sometimes called the enteric nervous system, made up of more neurons than exist in your entire spinal cord. It's estimated to house around 70% of your body's immune tissue. It communicates constantly, in both directions, with your brain, influencing mood, stress response, and mental clarity in ways researchers are still actively mapping. And it contains a living, responsive ecosystem capable of shifting its own composition in response to dietary change far faster than most people assume. Not over months, in some studies, within days. Margaret's stomach ache wasn't really about her stomach. It was about a sequence, a 15-minute window she'd been unknowingly working against for 2 years, waiting for someone to simply explain what her body had been asking for all along. Your body is asking too, every single morning, whether you've learned to notice it yet or not. The question was never really what you should eat for breakfast. It's what order you let your own biology unfold in before you ever pick up a spoon. And the next time your alarm goes off, you'll know something most people around you still don't, that your body already made its first decision of the day before you were even fully awake. The only thing left to decide is whether your next move works with it or against it.